Hey ladies, welcome back. This is the part 2 of Honors Bio Subday sketch notes. So if you're just tuning in for block 1, this is just finishing up the notes that we started yesterday. And block 2, just continuing what you were working on. So let's take a look. So taking a look, we just spoke about symmetry, this idea that the orientation of an organism is based on a plane or around an axis. And we mentioned this idea of radial symmetry, that essentially it radiates out from the center. And if you needed to, you could have shown that on just a simple drawing of a circle to make it easy. Next one we will talk about is asymmetrical. And you may or may not be familiar with this idea. Anytime you put the letter A in front of something, it means not, without, against. So against or without symmetry. So the idea here is that maybe we have something like the sponge that is not oriented along an axis. So for this one, there's really no way to put in any of the dotted lines because unfortunately it just doesn't show any kind of symmetry. Final type of symmetry that I want to be sure to mention to you then is going to be bilateral. Bilateral symmetry then is a plane that splits the body into identical right and left sides. And then if I were going to try and talk about this in terms of drawing a picture, I'm going to use a bug. Humans actually also exhibit this type of symmetry. Little bit tougher to draw. So for simply just trying to make this easy, we'll just draw a little beetle maybe. And then if you were looking at symmetry along that axis, essentially, if you were to fold this guy in half right here, he is exactly the same right versus left. So that right there is symmetry. Number 5 then, kind of jumping back to where we were before. We're going to talk about how organisms acquire and use that energy form. So in this case, there's essentially 2 ways we can do this. The first is being an autotroph. And hopefully you are familiar with the idea of auto meaning self. So it's going to produce its own energy. And that would be things like plants, for example. So for example, we have a photoautotroph, like plants. And they're generally turning light energy into chemical energy, in this case in the form of sugar, something that's a little more usable for other organisms or the plant itself. The opposite then of autotroph would be hetero. The prefix heterotroph just means other, so heterotroph. This organism is actually going to need to get its energy source from another organism. And in this case, it's actually specifically going to ingest other organisms. And there are 2 ways that an organism could accomplish this. The first one then is going to be ingestive. ingestive heterotrophs. That is really exactly what it sounds like. It is simply just the idea of eating, like Pac-Man. And then the opposite then would be, or the other would be absorptive. And absorptive are actually going to use enzymes to digest it outside the body. And then they're going to absorb. So digest outside and absorb. All right, final area that we're going to talk about today is going to be circling back a little bit to where we started. If you remember at the very beginning of this, we started with this idea of cellularity, unicellular, very simple organisms, multicellular, more complex, depends on the organism. In addition to these two classifications, we can also talk about organisms in terms of them being either eukaryotic or prokaryotic. So the first we'll look at is eukaryotes. And eukaryotes are going to be the ones that you think of most frequently when you think of cells. I know that everyone likes to comment that idea of mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. It's like the one thing everyone remembers from previous science courses. These are actually going to be eukaryotic cells. So these cells are going to have a nucleus. And membrane-bound organelle. And that simply means that the organelle are surrounded by a membrane. And we'll talk a lot about these membranes and the important role that they play a little bit later on. And then finally, they could be multicellular or unicellular. So this particular characteristic is simply describing the cell type, whereas these two are describing the number of cells. So then our last one, the opposite of eukaryote, is going to be prokaryotes. And in these prokaryotic cells, they're really going to be really plain. Maybe we add a couple dots. But the idea here is they're very, very simple, especially in comparison to the eukaryotic cell. And these cells have essentially just the opposite. No nucleus. No membrane-bound organelle. And we're actually really going to revisit that idea later when we talk about energy again. And then finally, prokaryotes are always unicellular. Turns out those cells need to be pretty small and pretty simple in order for them to function efficiently. They get too big or too many of them, and then without some of these more complex mechanisms, they're simply just not able to function. All right, so that's it for the notes for this on kingdom characteristics. It might be worthwhile to go ahead and add each of these individual ideas to our list over here on the side so that you have a nice, neat list in order to study from at a later date. I would also keep this handy. The next thing you're going to work on is the Venn diagram worksheet, and I think you'll find this very useful. See you ladies tomorrow.